If you would, take your Bible and go to John chapter 9. And if you don't have a Bible, please feel free to grab one under your seat or the seat in front of you. And the Bibles are there for you to use. The page number is always on the handout there, page 1110. That'll take you to John chapter number 9. John chapter number 9. And last week we talked about the fact that God made us as human beings to be relational. And we brought out the simple, I guess, common sense fact that if your relationships in your life, if they tend to be contentious and unhealthy, then you'll probably have a somewhat miserable life. If your relationships are healthy and they're vibrant, it will probably lead to a joyful and a very peaceful life. Well, in John chapter 9, the story centers on a man that was born blind. He'd never seen anything a day in his life. He didn't know what he looked like. He didn't know what his parents looked like. He had never seen the clouds, never knew what trees looked like. Can you imagine? He never ever saw anything. Look at John chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth." Look at verse number 6 and notice the compassion of Christ. It says, "When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go and wash in the pool of Siloam," which is by interpretation sent. "He went his way therefore and washed and came seeing." Well, the neighbors, the Snoopy neighbors were watching. How many of y'all remember about the Snoopy neighbors last week? Remember that? The Snoopy neighbors were watching, and so the neighbors get involved, and they want to know what happened. And then they get the Pharisees involved. Look at verse 13. It says, the neighbors brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. So now they get the Pharisees involved. The Pharisees were the religious leaders. And the thing is this. They were very religious, and they knew all about religion, but they were relational nightmares. I mean, just relational nightmares. In the Bible, you'll never see a Pharisee in a close, loving relationship. And the reason why is very simple. The Pharisees tended to be very judgmental people. They were very critical. They were haughty. They were kind of obnoxious, very full of themselves. And the Pharisees were like sandpaper relationally. You know, they just kind of rubbed everybody the wrong way. And I said last week that we all have a little Pharisee in us. Can I get an amen out there, huh? It's called the flesh. And that's why marriages bust up and friendships break apart. And that's why people get real mad and leave church. And, this is why, families get in family disputes and quarrels is because of this. You know, we all deal with this to a certain extent. Nobody's got like the perfect personality. We all have parts of our personality that involve, relational issues. And we have character flaws. And we got things that maybe we've done since childhood. And so there's these issues. Now, the good thing is this, all right? And this is what the Pharisees would not accept and understand. But yet, it's true, is that the good news is this, is that if we know Jesus Christ, His Spirit can change us. All right? So that's the good news. So, if you really want to change, and if you really want healthy relationships in your life, I'm telling you flat out, you can have them. And we began to take the negative example of the Pharisees, and we began last week to turn it into some positive principles. 3 keys, really, to healthy relationships. And the first key that we began to look at, it's in your handout, is that we need to have the attitude that we're never going to stop being a learner. We're going to always be in a lifetime student, so to speak. The Pharisees were not. In fact, they said to the blind man that was healed, he's trying to explain it to him, trying to tell him about Jesus. And they had the attitude, "Dost thou teach us?" They were unteachable. They did not want to be taught. They did not want to learn. They did not want to grow. They thought they had everything figured out. And here's the deal. The Pharisee in us really doesn't want to see the blind spots. By the way, how many of us have blind spots in our life? We all do. But do we want to see them? Let's let you think on that for a minute. Do we really want to see them? And do we want to know what our blind spots are? Do we have mentors in our life that know they have liberty to tell us? And that can coach us up, so to speak. And that we know they love us, we know they care about us, so we're going to therefore take it and learn from it. We need that in our life. We need spiritual coaches, and we need mentors, and we need people at work who will tell us the truth. But what happens is when we're not a learner, we get stuck in unhealthy patterns of behavior. Many times it comes from childhood. Our parents let us act a certain way, and it got ingrained in us, And it's like we've acted that way since we were kids or teenagers. And so now it's kind of like become this ingrained behavior, not healthy at all, not good, rubs people wrong, but yet we're stuck because we're not learning anymore. We're not growing. So we got to have the attitude that we're going to be learners. We're going to keep learning. I'm going to keep learning. I'm going to keep growing. I'm going to find out. I want to learn more about myself. I want to learn more about my spouse. I want to learn more about my kids. I want to learn more about how I can know God better, how I can know the Bible better, how that I can be a better parent. We're ever learning. We just realized, man, I'm a work in progress, and I got to keep learning. Y'all agree that ought to be the attitude we ought to have? Amen. Opposite of the Pharisee. Well, there's a second reason why the Pharisees were never in loving relationships, healthy relationships. And that brings me to my second point. And I want to take kind of a negative of the Pharisees, but turn it into a positive principle for us. And I'm going to show it to you here in the Bible in a minute. But here it is. I want you to write this in your handout. The second key to healthy relationships, and we're going to spend the rest of the morning on this key. Work on becoming a good listener. Work, and it is work. Work on becoming a good listener. Now, here you got a guy over here. He's been healed. He was blind. He had never seen anything a day in his life. He is healed. He can see. It's a miracle, right? Well, you would think the Pharisees, as the religious leaders of the day, you would think they would have been rejoicing over this. I mean, happy about this miracle. You'd also kind of think that they would be like sitting at the feet of Jesus, and they would be eager to listen, eager to learn, eager to try to figure out more about this Jesus. But we don't see that at all with the Pharisees. They aren't one bit interested in learning about Jesus Christ. Instead, they were on a seek and destroy mission, and it began by interrogating the guy's parents. Look at verse 18. It says, "But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, 'Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?' His parents answered them, and they said, 'We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who has opened his eyes, we know not. He's of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself.' These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews, because the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he, Jesus, was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, 'He is of age, ask him.'" Well, the Pharisees haul this guy back in. They've already talked to him once. He's already told his story to him once. They haul him back in again. Look at verse 24. It says, "Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, 'Give God the praise. We know that this man,'" Jesus, "'is a sinner.' He answered and he said, 'Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see.' Then said they to him again, 'What did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes?'" I love this. Verse 27 is classic. They ask him, he's already told them the story. So I love his answer in verse 27 here. He answered them, "I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore should you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples?" He's like, "I have told you, but you weren't listening. I've been talking, but you haven't been listening. If I say it again, will you believe me? If I say it again, will you listen? If I say it again, will you be his disciple?" He says, "You guys aren't listening to me. I've already been over this." And I hear this all the time. Husbands say about their wives, "She won't listen, Pastor Nate." And wives say about their husbands, they say to my wife, Miss Denise, he won't listen. Parents say about their teenagers, boy, my teenager will not listen to a thing. And then the teenagers say to Pastor Rob, my parents won't listen. Right? People at work, nobody will listen to me at work. You know, this is something that you hear over and over again. And the reason why this is such an issue in relationships is because the Pharisee in us is very fond of talking. Very fond of making our point, expressing our opinions, and making known our feelings. But the Pharisee in us is not real keen about just sitting and listening to somebody else. In fact, look at James 1:19 in your handout. I've got it right there in your handout this morning. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man, say it with me, be swift to what? What does swift mean? Yeah, quickly, quick. You be quick to hear. Listen, right? And then he says, but be slow to what? Speak, slow to wrath. Would you all agree with me? We get that turned around sometimes. We're swift to speak and we're slow to hear, right? And it creates all kinds of relational problems in our life. I mean, is it any wonder that we always have new talk shows coming on the radio and on TV? Hey, there's a new talk show. When's the last time you heard, hey, there's a great listen show on TV coming up? Pharisees are good talkers, but they're not good listeners. And what happens is, when that happens, we cease the process of learning, and here's what happens. I'm going to tell you, all right? Tell you exactly what happens. When we quit listening and learning, we turn from disciple into critic. What's a disciple? A disciple is a learner, a pupil. That's what the word literally means, a learner and a pupil. It goes back to my first point last week. And when we don't learn to listen, which is my second point, we don't learn. And when we don't learn, we're no longer a disciple. We turn into a critic. And we become critical of our kids, critical of our spouse, critical of the church, critical of the youth group, critical of everybody at work, critical of our boss, critical of our people underneath us at work that work for us. We turn from disciple into critic. And it can happen to any Christian. And what's amazing is we are so able to compartmentalize. We're so good at that in America. We may actually be a good listener at work. And we listen to our boss or we listen to our clients. Very good. We're very good at listening. We get home, we won't hear a word our spouse has to say. It just, phew, you know? Or we're really a good listener maybe at home. But we're terrible at church. We won't listen at church. We won't take in spiritual truth and learn and listen. So we can compartmentalize. So we need to ask ourselves, either are there areas of my life where I just don't listen good? I'm not listening intently. I'm not listening to my kids or my spouse or listening at work or listening at church. I'm tending to talk too much and not listen. You see, Pharisees are not learners, so they aren't listeners. They're not good listeners. But in your handout, it says that a godly person has learned the biblical art of listening. And then it says, look at your handout, the only way we can truly learn is by listening. It's the truth, isn't it? Now look, that's not my opinion. I want you to look at the Bible. Look in your handout. I've got some verses there I want you to look at. Look at it with me. Proverbs 15, 31 and 32. The ear that heareth the reproof of life abideth among the wise. He that refuseth instruction despiseth his own soul. You're your own worst enemy. You won't listen. But he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. And you learn when you listen. Look at the next one. Proverbs 17, 27 and 28. It says, he that has knowledge spares his words. And a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. I love this. Even a fool, when he holds his peace, is counted wise. And he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. Look at the next one, Proverbs 18:13. It's one of my favorite verses. I think it's so true. This is, I think, where we get into problems. He that answers a matter before he hears it, it's a folly and shame unto him. In other words, we don't take time to really listen. We're so quick to talk, and so we give an answer at work, or we give an answer to a client, or we give an answer to someone at church, or we give an answer to our spouse, and we don't hear the whole thing out the Bible says it ends up, you end up with egg on your face. It's a folly and a shame unto him. So the Bible, would you guys agree with me? Come on, talk to me. Do you agree with me that the Bible puts a high premium on listening? Yes. I just gave you a sample. The Bible puts a very high value on hearing and listening. Now, it's not, listen, I'm going to tell you, listening's not easy. It is one of the most challenging things you'll ever do. Listening the right way. And I think it's because there's so much noise and distraction in our minds. We call this the age of communication. And it is, right? But there is so much in our minds. We with cell phones and texting and emails and tweets. It's like, man, there's a whole lot of talking going on, but how much listening is going on? In your handout, it says, people who have not mastered the godly virtue of listening are going to have relational problems everywhere they go in life. Everywhere you go, you're going to have problems unless you learn to listen. For example, in marriage, I'll just kind of hit on that for a minute. Marriage conference coming up. The only way to truly understand your spouse is to listen. You're not going to understand her any other way. You're not going to understand him any other way. You got to take time to listen. And while you're listening, truly listen. Don't be thinking of what you're going to say next. Don't be thinking about fantasy football, guys. Ladies, don't be thinking about the sale they got going on at the pavilion. While you're listening, truly listen. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, about how to be a good listener. But for right now, let me just say, many times we hear, but we don't listen. In other words, guys, sometimes our wife is talking and we hear noise, but it's like, that's exactly what we're hearing. We're no more taking in and digesting what she's saying than anything. And sometimes, sometimes we want to fix our spouse rather than just listen. And sometimes, guys, all our wives really need us to do is listen. They don't want you to fix them. They just want to know you care. And the way you show you care is by listening. Funny little video I'll show you. It's called It's Not About the Nail. And it's about a minute and a half. Just a little short, quick little video. Let's bring the volume up a little bit on it, please, so that it's good and it's kind of a soft video. So I want you to be able to hear a conversation between a husband and a wife. Watch this.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head. And it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. That's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way. It's not about the nail, amen? She just wanted him to listen. Parents, can I talk to you for a minute? How many of you in here are parents? Raise your hand. How many of you still got kids at home? Just kind of hold your hand up. You still got kids. You're not empty nest yet. Raise your hand up high. Okay, all over the auditorium. Tons of hands. Can I share something with you? And I mean this. I've pretty much raised mine now. And I'm going to share something with you from my heart. Part of your job as a parent is to teach your children to grow up to be good listeners and to learn how to take instruction. I don't care if it's in sports, they have to listen to their coach. I coached baseball for years. Some kids were not coachable, and it goes back to the home. They were never taught to listen. And they already have those marks of a Pharisee. They think they knew everything. I don't care what it is. School, you have to teach your kids to listen. If you look at the screen, Proverbs 15:5 says, "A fool despiseth his father's instruction, but he that regardeth reproof is prudent." Look at the next verse. It says, "He is in the way of life that keeps instruction, but he that refuseth reproof erreth." Your kids have to be taught to listen. Now, one way to do that, a great way to do that, is to set the example and you be a good listener. When your child talks or your teenager talks, really listen. Just forget everything you're doing, look them in the eye and listen. As parents, sometimes we need to quit talking, we need to shut our mouths, and we need to listen to our kids or our teenagers. Once they start talking, let them talk. Don't feel like you got to fix whatever. Don't feel like you have to, give them a lecture. Just let them talk. The only way to truly understand, for example, at work, an opposing position at work, you got to really listen to the other person and listen. The only way to understand at church maybe something that you got a problem with, you got to listen to the other view, listen to the other person. We know that no marriage will be successful without good ongoing communication. I mean, we're not dumb, we know that. Every marriage has to have good ongoing communication or it's not going to be a good marriage. But a big part, a huge part of good conversation is listening. Listening. If we don't learn to listen, we end up doing what the Pharisees did in our text. You know what happens when we don't? What an example here. Here's what happens when we don't listen. Write this in your handout. Number one, here's what happens. When we don't listen, we jump to false conclusions. We jump to false. They're not true. We think they're true in our mind, but it's not. There's not any truth in it. But we think it's true. Why? Because we're not listening. Look at verse 16. Verse 16. Everybody look at that. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man's not of God. They said Jesus is not of God because he keeps not the Sabbath day. Look up here. Was Jesus of God? Yes or no? Of course he was. Did he keep the Sabbath day? Did Jesus obey God's command to keep the Sabbath? Yes or no? Yes. But because they didn't listen, they jumped to false conclusions. Happens all the time in relationships. Number two, we use conversation to try and force agreement to our way of thinking. This is big. This is huge. And that's exactly what the Pharisees did. Look at verse 24. It says, then again called they the man that was blind. They said unto him, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. What are they doing? They're trying to use brute force. They're trying to intimidate this guy into agreeing with them. And many times we take conversation, and instead of listening, we try to use conversation to manipulate. We try to force agreement to our way of thinking. Number three, the third thing that happens when we don't listen is that we hear, but we don't understand. I think verse 26 is worth looking at again. Look at it. It says, then said they to him again, what did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I've told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? They were hearing, but not understanding. And that's what happens when we don't listen good. Number four, the fourth thing that happens when we aren't good listeners is that we end up using conversation to punish each other. Oh boy, the Pharisees were huge on this. Look at verse number 28. Everybody look at verse 28. Look at this. It says, then they reviled him. I mean, the guy hasn't seen a day in his life. The guy's got his eyesight. You'd think they'd be rejoicing with him. They revile him. You know what that means? It means they're like calling him names. They're like ridiculing the guy. They reviled him. And they said, thou art his disciple. We are Moses' disciples. Look at verse number 34. It says, they answered and they said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. It is never a good thing to use conversation to punish someone else. Don't ever do that. You say, why, Pastor Dan? Nothing good will come out of that. Nothing. When you use conversation to punish someone at work, to punish your spouse, to punish your kids, to punish your mom and dad, when you use conversation to punish, nothing good will come out of that. No problems will get solved. You will end up creating deeper and deeper problems for yourself when you do that. Never use conversation to punish. Be a good listener. Now, how do we become good listeners? I want to give you 3 principles, and I really want you to listen. This is where we make application. Number 1 is this. Number 1, write this in your handout. You have to give to the other person your undivided attention. There's a verse, 1 Peter 3:8. Interesting, this verse is in the context of marriage. Did you know that? 1 Peter 3:7 talks about husbands and wives praying together, knowing each other. Do you know what the next verse says? 1 Peter 3:8. 2 simple words. Be courteous. Be courteous. Teenagers, you need to be courteous to your parents. Parents, you need to be courteous to your teenager. Husbands, you need to be courteous to your wife. Wives, you need to be courteous to your husband. And part of courtesy is giving someone our undivided attention. You know, listening is something that's tough. It has to be learned and practiced. Because here's the deal. And I know a lot of you can relate to this. In ordinary listening, here's what we do. In ordinary listening, we're listening to them talk, we're hearing the words that they're saying, and we're thinking, where do I agree? Where do I disagree? What am I going to say in response to this? In other words, the focus is still on us. Even when we're listening, in our minds, the focus is on us. In genuine biblical listening, the spotlight moves to the other person. And now all of a sudden, as we listen, we're putting ourselves in their shoes. We're trying to tune into their wavelength. We're listening from within their frame of reference. We're listening not just to their words either. We're trying to see what's behind the words, the underlying emotions, the underlying feelings and needs. And we're asking ourselves as we listen, what do they need? What are they wanting here? We give to them our undivided attention. And by the way, I think this is a lost art today, especially with young people. It is still a common courtesy to look somebody in the eye when you're talking to them. And many kids have no concept of that today because they're looking down at their phone, they're looking down at their tablet, their computer. It is proper etiquette to look someone in the eye. When you're in a meeting at work, look at the person that has the floor. Don't be looking down at your phone or your computer. That's rude. Everyone wants to be heard. And so when you are making eye contact, then you're sending that message that, hey, what you're saying is important to me. And as you listen, you're connecting with them. You can't do that when you're looking down at your phone or looking down at your computer. Very important in marriage. Very important in marriage. Listen, I encourage you, don't make your spouse talk to you through the newspaper. Don't make them talk to you through your phone. Don't make them talk to you through your Facebook page. Don't make them talk to you, guys, don't make your wife talk to you through ESPN. Listen, your wife does not want to have to compete with Chris Berman, all right? Be a good listener. Let me share an idea with you. When you're out to eat, husbands and wives, or friends, if you're out with a friend, try leaving your phones in the car. I'm going to make a promise to you. Here it is. You ready? The world will still be spinning when you come out of the restaurant. And believe it or not, the human race will be able to manage without you having your phone for an hour. It'll still be there when you get done. But see, what will happen is you won't get distracted. You'll be able to look your spouse in the eye and have meaningful conversation. or even light conversation. Doesn't even have to be deep, but you're able to truly focus on that other person and listen. When it comes to our children, we need to be courteous. Give them your undivided attention. Don't make your kids talk to you again over a book or your computer, or, look them in the eye, parents, and talk to your kids. Let them listen to them. And be courteous. Just because they're our children doesn't mean that we can talk to them rude. Just because they're our children doesn't give us the right to be hateful, to be non-courteous. Treat them the same way you would someone else's kids at church. Treat them with that same courtesy. I heard one person give some pretty wise advice. They said, be nice to your kids, they'll choose your nursing home. I said, that's a lot of truth in that. Be nice to your kids, they'll choose your nursing home. So give to them your undivided attention. The second key concept here in being a good listener, number 2, is respond to what the other person says. Now, I want to make one thing very clear here. Being a good listener doesn't mean you never respond. Being a good listener doesn't mean you never talk. That's rude. All right? And, when the other person shares their heart and you say nothing, that kind of indicates to them you really don't care or you're indifferent. So in the appropriate time and in the appropriate way, we respond back. We show that we're listening by responding. And by the way, I got to say this, guys, a grunt doesn't count as a response. That doesn't count. Your wife bears her heart, and she talks for 5 or 10 minutes solid, and then when she's all done, she looks at you and you go, That doesn't count, all right. Respond. Listen closely, attentively, but then respond. And I'll just say this. I think one example here in the text is that Jesus Christ said to the man that was born blind, remember he was cast out of the temple. Jesus comes to him and he says, do you believe on the Son of God? He responds back with a question. And he says, Lord, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And then Jesus was able to clarify and said, you've both seen him, and it's he that talks with you. So sometimes a great way to respond is by asking questions to clarify. Or another great way to respond is by repeating back what they said to you in your own words. Respond back by repeating back in your own words what they have communicated and see if it's accurate. You say, hey, honey, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is, or you say, ladies, to your husband, hey, listen, if I understand you right, then how you're feeling is this. That way you clarify, say, but you respond. Number 3, respect the other person's opinions and feelings. One of the things that made a Pharisee is they had absolutely no respect for someone else's opinions and feelings. Look at verse number 34. Verse 34. It says, they answered and they said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. They are cutting and they are rude. And they're like, hey, dude, conversation over, man. You are out of here. They take him and lift the guy out and they toss him out of the temple. How rude. They have no respect for that guy's feelings or his opinions whatsoever. And I think sometimes we cast people out. Maybe not physically, I hope not. We don't actually take our spouse and throw them out the door. We don't take our kids and throw them in the street. We don't take someone at work and, literally physically, toss them out of our office. But many times we do cast people out verbally and emotionally. We just close down conversation by our words and by our actions. I just want to encourage you to respect the other person. That's a way to be a good listener is respect. Listen, you may not agree. That's life, man. That's normal. I don't know of a husband and wife that agree on everything. I don't know of a church where everyone in the church agrees on everything. I don't know of a workplace where everyone at work agrees on everything. That's just normal. That's just life. And while you may not agree, you can seek to understand their viewpoint and respect that. I heard one person say this, and I think it was so wise. Listen to this. He said, listening may be the golden key that opens the door to human relationships. Conflict costs a lot. When we're not a good listener, it leads to conflict, and conflict is costly. Conflict costs us emotionally. It costs us physically in our health. Conflict costs us mentally. It distracts us. Conflict costs us sometimes in tangible ways. We end up in lawsuits. Conflict leads to broken relationships. Conflict is costly. But many times it could be avoided if we would just learn to listen. To truly put ourselves in the other person's shoes and listen from their viewpoint. Not listening to try to find a hole in what they're saying. Not listening to try to prove our point. Not listening, so that we'll know how to respond to them and really get them, and win the argument. No, we're listening to their heart. We're listening to what's motivating their words. We're listening to what's making them tick in that moment. Husbands, there are things that you can learn from your wife if you'll listen. Ladies, you can say amen right there. That's all right. Ladies, there's things you can learn from your husband. Parents, there's things we can learn from. Y'all think parents can learn from kids? Whew, you better know it. That boss that you don't like very much, believe it or not, there's things you can learn if you'll listen. But when you quit listening, you quit learning. And in your handout it says when you quit learning, you quit growing. And you become relegated to the role of the Pharisee. And before you put your handout up, can you look up here? I want to give you one quick challenge. Some messages you may not apply for a week or 2 or a month because it doesn't really apply in your moment. Hey, look up here. Everyone in this room can instantly apply what you've heard today. And listen to this. Listening is contagious. If you become a good listener, you will find those around you will listen to you better. There's a chain reaction many times that happens. And so the next conversation you have, and I know most of you are going to have a conversation today. So that's why I say we can all apply this today. The next conversation that you have with a coworker, a client, a child, a friend, a spouse, a stranger, give them your full attention. Listen to the human being behind the words. Because one of the biggest gifts that you can ever give somebody is the gift of being heard. The gift of being heard. Thank you for listening today. Let's go to the Lord in prayer right now.